200 feet beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, a diver drops into the largest crater ever carved by an American weapon. This is the exact spot where, 7 decades ago, a hydrogen bomb tore 3 islands out of the sea in a single morning. Everything the diver expects to see is gray. A dead seabed of rubble and ash and silence. The underwater version of a moonscape. Instead, the water opens into something almost impossible to believe. Towers of living coral rise from the crater floor, some of them taller than a 2-story house. Branching colonies spread out like drowned forests, their limbs as thick as tree branches. Schools of fish move through the ruins in the thousands, and gliding above all of it, unbothered and everywhere, are sharks. This is Bikini Atoll. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 23 nuclear weapons here. Islands were vaporized, the lagoon was poisoned, and the people who had lived on this land for thousands of years were carried away and never allowed to return. By every reasonable measure, this should be one of the deadest stretches of ocean on the planet. At least that is what almost everyone expected. But the real story is far stranger. Today, the reef at Bikini Atoll has done more than survive. It ranks among the healthiest coral reefs left anywhere in the Pacific. Marine biologists who came here expecting a wasteland found more life than they see on reefs that were never touched by a single bomb. So how does a place that absorbed the force of 1,000 Hiroshimas come back stronger than the reefs we protect and visit and love? The answer is not what you would guess, and it says something deeply uncomfortable about the rest of the ocean and about us. Long before the crater, before the fallout, before the world had ever learned to split an atom, Bikini was a small ring of coral islands in the northern Marshall Islands, halfway between Hawaii and Australia. From the air, it looked like a thin green necklace laid across open ocean. A shallow lagoon sat in the center. A chain of palm-covered islets ran around the rim, and beneath the waterline lay a reef that had been building itself for millions of years. People had lived here for something like 2,000 years. They were expert sailors and fishermen who read the ocean the way other cultures read maps. They lived on coconut and breadfruit and arrowroot, on fish and turtle eggs and seabirds, all of it in abundance. Land ownership sat at the very center of their culture. To have no land was to have no standing, and every family on Bikini had land, handed down through more generations than anyone could count. Beneath the surface, the reef was one of the richest in the entire Pacific. Warm, clear water and steady currents had fed it for age after age, until it teemed with hundreds of kinds of coral and more fish than anyone could ever count. When American scientists surveyed the lagoon in the 1940s, before a single bomb had fallen, they wrote down a careful living catalog of everything that grew there. No one understood it at the time, but that quiet list of corals would one day become the measuring stick for one of the strangest recovery stories in the history of science. Then, in the winter of 1946, an American naval officer arrived and asked them to leave. His name was Commodore Ben Wyatt, and he gathered the community together after church one Sunday. He told them the United States wanted to use their home to test a new kind of weapon, a weapon so powerful it might end all war forever. He asked the 167 people of Bikini to give up their islands for the good of all mankind. The leader of the community, a man named King Judah, thought it over and answered that they would go, believing everything was in the hands of God. They did not understand what they were agreeing to. Almost no one on earth truly did. What looked like a temporary favor, a short trip away while the Americans finished their work, would become an exile that has now lasted nearly 80 years, and counting. The Navy helped them take apart their church and their community hall, board by board, and load their lives onto landing craft. They were carried about 125 miles east to an uninhabited atoll called Rongerik, a place 1/6 the size of Bikini, with far less food and far less fresh water. In their own traditions, Rongerik was said to be haunted. Within a couple of years, the people sent there were slowly starving. Meanwhile, back at their true home, the experiment had already begun. The first operation was called Crossroads. In the summer of 1946, the American military assembled a ghost fleet inside Bikini's lagoon. More than 90 warships, some captured from Germany and Japan, others worn-out cruisers and destroyers and submarines from their own navy, were anchored in neat rows to see what an atomic blast would do to them. To make the experiment complete, the military tied living animals to the target ships. Goats, pigs, and rats were chained to the decks and sealed inside the gun turrets so that scientists could measure exactly what the radiation would do to flesh and blood. The whole event was filmed and broadcast to a watching world. For a brief moment, this remote lagoon became the most famous stretch of water on Earth, a stage for the terrifying new power that had just ended one war and now seemed ready to reshape every war that came after it. The first bomb, dropped from a plane, went off above the fleet. The second was the one that changed the water forever. On the 25th of July, 1946, a nuclear device was detonated underwater, directly beneath the anchored ships. The ocean did something no one had ever witnessed. A column of seawater a mile high erupted into the sky, its walls 300 feet thick, lifting entire battleships upward like toys. When it collapsed, it sent a wave nearly 100 feet tall rolling across the lagoon and dumped roughly 500,000 tons of radioactive mud onto everything below. That single underwater test contaminated the fleet, the lagoon, and the reef so thoroughly that the Navy decided Bikini was too small to keep using and moved on to other atolls. For a few years, Bikini fell silent. But that silence would not hold, because the most destructive chapter of all was still ahead. In 1954, the testing returned to Bikini, and this time the Americans were no longer working with ordinary atomic bombs. They had built something far larger, a hydrogen bomb, and the test was code-named Bravo. On the morning of March 1st, 1954, they detonated it on a shallow reef at the edge of the atoll. The scientists had predicted a blast of about 6 megatons. What they got was 15. Their math was off by more than double, and the difference was measured in millions of tons of explosive force. Bravo was, and still is, the largest nuclear weapon the United States has ever set off. It was more than 1,000 times as powerful as the bomb that flattened Hiroshima. In an instant, 3 of the atoll's islands simply ceased to exist, vaporized into the fireball. The water around Ground Zero flashed to temperatures many times hotter than the surface of the sun. The blast gouged a crater into the reef more than 1 mile wide and 240 feet deep, a wound so large it can be seen from space. A mushroom cloud climbed more than 20 miles into the sky, and the ground shook on islands more than 100 miles away. Then came the part the planners had not accounted for. The wind shifted. Bravo lifted around 10 million tons of pulverized coral, sand, and seawater into the atmosphere and turned it into fallout. Instead of drifting out over empty ocean, that radioactive ash blew east, straight over inhabited islands. On Rongelap Atoll, about 100 miles away, a fine, white powder began falling out of the sky like snow. The children there had never seen snow before. Some of them played in it, rubbing it on their skin and into their hair, with no idea that every grain was radioactive debris from a hydrogen bomb. The people of Rongelap were not evacuated for 2 more days. In the years that followed, they suffered radiation burns, thyroid disease, cancers, and miscarriages. A Japanese fishing boat that had strayed too close returned home with its entire crew sick from radiation, and one of them later died. Castle Bravo produced the worst nuclear fallout in recorded history, and it did so during what was supposed to be a controlled experiment on a clear morning with no war anywhere in sight. By the time the testing finally ended in 1958, 23 nuclear weapons had been detonated at Bikini. The atoll that had been home to a fishing people for 2,000 years was now a radioactive ruin. Its soil was laced with cesium and strontium and plutonium. Its lagoon held the fallout of 1,000 Hiroshimas, and its owners were still gone. The story of the Bikini people only grew sadder from there. In the late 1960s, the United States declared the atoll cleaned and safe and told the exiles they could finally come home. Some families returned in the early 1970s. They planted crops, they ate the coconuts and the fish, and then, in 1978, doctors testing their bodies found alarming levels of radioactive cesium, absorbed straight from the local food. They were evacuated all over again. For the people of Bikini, it was the second time their own home had turned against them, and the second time a promise of safety had proven false. Some of the elders, who had been carried away as children in 1946, were now old men and women who had spent almost their entire lives waiting to go back. Many of them died on other islands, in exile, and never set foot on Bikini again. Bikini has been empty ever since. The land is still too contaminated to farm. Recent studies have found radiation in some bikini fruit at levels higher than the food around Chernobyl and Fukushima. The United States has paid out more than $300 million in compensation, and still, 3 generations later, the descendants of King Judah have never been allowed to move home. Think about that for a moment. An entire people, exiled from a homeland that is technically at peace, kept away by an enemy they cannot see, taste, or fight. So here is the picture the world carried for decades. A poisoned atoll of vaporized islands and a crater visible from orbit, its lagoon soaked in fallout, a place so dangerous that its own people were not allowed to live there. If ever there were a stretch of ocean you would expect to be dead, this was it. And that is exactly why what was happening underwater is so hard to explain. For nearly 50 years after the first bomb, almost no one went to Bikini. There was no reason to. The islands were off limits, so no one fished the lagoon because the fish were assumed to be poisonous. No one built hotels along the shore because no one was allowed to live there. No boats dragged nets across the reef, and no anchors tore up the coral. There was no sewage, no farm runoff, no plastic, no construction, no tourists. For the first time in the entire history of the atoll, the reef was left completely and utterly alone. And a reef, it turns out, is very good at using solitude. The first hint came slowly. Divers who visited in the early 2000s began describing something that did not match the story of a dead zone. So in 2008, an international team of marine scientists, drawn from Australia, Germany, Italy, Hawaii, and the Marshall Islands, mounted a full expedition to find out what had really become of the reef at Bikini. They did something almost no one had dared to try. They dove straight down into the Bravo crater. One of the researchers later admitted he had braced himself for a kind of underwater moonscape, a barren scar where the bomb had scraped the reef down to nothing. That was not what he found. Rising out of the crater floor were enormous branching corals, some of them reaching 26 feet in height, with trunks nearly a foot thick. In places across the lagoon, living coral covered the seabed so densely that it blanketed most of the bottom. The very ground zero of the largest bomb America ever built had grown itself a coral cathedral. There were giant clams resting on the crater floor, and fish that had clearly never learned to fear a fishing line. In the parts of the lagoon the blasts had spared, the coral grew in dense, tangled thickets, alive with color, as though the 20th century had simply never happened down here. For the scientists hovering above it in the water, it was almost impossible to square what their instruments were telling them about the radiation with what their own eyes were showing them about the life. When the team compared the reef to the detailed surveys the American military had taken before the testing back in the 1940s, the results were even more startling. Nearly 3/4 of the coral species recorded before the bombs were still there. The reef had done far more than cling to life in a few sheltered corners. It had rebuilt itself across the lagoon and over the crater, in the shadow of the most violent thing human beings have ever done to a piece of ocean. If stories like this one, about how nature responds when the pressure of the modern world is lifted off it, are the reason you are here, take 1 second to subscribe before we go on. It really does help these deep dives reach more people who would never find them otherwise. Now, back to the mystery. Before we get to why the reef came back, it helps to pull back and look at what is happening to coral reefs everywhere else. Across the rest of the planet, reefs are in serious trouble. They are being overfished until the big fish disappear. They are being smothered by runoff from farms and cities. They are being scraped by anchors and nets, choked by plastic, and bleached by warming seas. The single most destructive force acting on the world's coral reefs is something far more ordinary than a disaster. It is the constant, everyday presence of human beings. And that is the key that finally unlocks Bikini. The reef there did not thrive because radiation was somehow good for it. Let me be very clear about that, because it is the part people get wrong. Radiation did real harm here, and some of that harm is still unfolding today. The reef thrived because of what was taken away, not because of what the bombs left behind. When the United States sealed off the atoll, it accidentally created something the modern ocean almost never gets, a reef with no people on it at all. No fishing meant the fish were allowed to grow back to a size and a number you simply do not see anywhere near human settlements. And when the fish came back, the predators came back with them. This is the detail that stunned the scientists the most. The sharks at Bikini are not scarce and skittish, the way they are on most reefs, where they have been hunted for generations. At Bikini, the sharks are abundant and bold because for half a century, nobody hunted them. A thriving population of sharks and big fish is the signature of a reef that is working exactly the way it is supposed to. The Stanford marine biologist who led a major survey of the atoll put it plainly. The marine life at Bikini, he said, is protected by the terrible history of the place. The fish are doing better here than in many other locations precisely because they have been left completely alone. So we discovered, entirely by accident, what a coral reef can do when the one thing it cannot survive is finally removed. And the one thing it could not survive in the end was us. It helps to understand how a reef actually heals because it works very differently from a forest growing back. A coral reef is really a vast underwater city built by tiny animals, each coral polyp no bigger than a grain of rice, working together by the billions to lay down stone. When the bombs struck, they did not kill every colony. In the sheltered corners and along the deeper slopes, pockets of coral survived. And every year, those survivors released clouds of microscopic larvae into the water, drifting on the currents, searching for bare rock to settle on and begin again. With no nets scraping the seabed and no pollution clouding the water, those larvae found exactly what they needed. Clean, open surfaces bathed in sunlight, with grazing fish keeping the algae in check so that young coral could take hold. Slowly, colony by colony, decade by decade, the reef stitched itself back together, spreading outward from the survivors the way a wound closes over. What looked like a miracle was really just biology, handed the one thing it almost never gets: time and space and silence. There is a strange and haunting parallel to this on land, on the other side of the world. Around the ruined reactor at Chernobyl, inside the exclusion zone where radiation drove every human being away, wildlife has come flooding back. Wolves, boar, deer, and rare birds now live in a forest that people fled in terror. The same radiation that made the land deadly to humans also made it a refuge from humans. And in that refuge, nature did what nature always does when we finally step out of the way. It returned. But this is where the story turns once more, and where it would be a mistake to call Bikini a simple happy ending, because the recovery is not complete, and it may never be. When scientists looked closely at which corals had returned and which had not, they found that some species present before the testing were simply gone from Bikini, locally extinct, wiped out, and never re-established. In the places where the bombs had ground the reef down to bare rubble and sand, there was no reef left at all, and after 70 years, still nothing had grown back. Recovery at Bikini is patchy. It is astonishing where it happened, and it is total where it did not. And there is a slower danger still hiding in the sediment. The fallout did not simply vanish. long-lived radioactive elements, cesium, plutonium, and americium, are still settled deep into the mud of the lagoon and the crater, and they will stay dangerous for centuries. Researchers warn that these isotopes could quietly shape the reef's future, affecting how the coral and the tiny organisms it depends on are able to grow and spread over long stretches of time. The reef looks triumphant today. What the radiation is doing to it across a 100-year timescale, no one yet fully knows. When a team from Stanford went back to study the reef more closely, they went looking for exactly this kind of hidden damage. They drilled core samples out of the giant corals and measured the radiation locked inside them, reading the coral almost like tree rings to see what the atom had left behind. To the eye, the marine life looked remarkably healthy, and yet the fingerprints of the bombs were still there, woven into the living tissue of the reef itself. On the shore, they found something even more unsettling. The coconut crabs, enormous land crabs that climb trees and crack coconuts with their claws, were still carrying dangerous levels of radioactivity in their bodies, drawn up through the contaminated food chain. A creature you could hold in your two hands looked completely ordinary and was quietly, invisibly radioactive. It was a hard reminder that thriving and safe are two very different words. Then there is the cruelest contradiction of all. The water at Bikini is overflowing with life, while the land at its very edge is still too poisoned to live on. The fish swirl over thriving coral, and just a few feet above the waterline, the coconuts and the fruit carry enough radioactive cesium to keep human beings away. Not long ago, a National Geographic expedition surveyed Bikini and came away with the very same conclusion. Where the reef survived, it is now healthier than most of the reefs across the wider Pacific. And there is something bitter hidden inside that comparison. A reef that was bombed 23 times is now outperforming reefs that were never bombed at all. Reefs we fish and dive and photograph and swear that we are protecting. Bikini looks good, in part, because so much of the ocean we actually live beside has come to look so much worse. Yet the people who own this place, the descendants of the families carried off in 1946, still cannot go home. Sit with that for a moment. The reef has recovered, but the people who belong to it still have not been allowed to. Nature was handed 80 years of solitude and used every year of it to heal, while the human beings were handed 80 years of exile and are still waiting today. And that is the real lesson buried inside the coral of Bikini Atoll, the one that reaches far beyond this single ring of islands in the middle of the Pacific. We like to think of ourselves as the protectors of nature, the caretakers who step in to fix what is broken. Bikini quietly tells a different story. This reef was saved in the end by our absence. Nobody ran a conservation program here. Nobody cleaned it up or came to its rescue. For 50 years, this stretch of ocean was simply left to itself, and that turned out to be enough. It survived 23 nuclear bombs and came back stronger than reefs we swim over on vacation, healthier than reefs we have set aside and sworn to guard, for one reason above all others. We were not there. That fact should stop every one of us cold. If the single most powerful thing we can do for a coral reef is to leave it entirely alone, then the slow damage we are doing to every other reef on Earth, the fishing and the runoff and the warming and the noise, is far greater than we let ourselves believe. The bombs were loud and sudden and over in a single morning. What we do to the ocean the rest of the time is quiet and constant, and it never seems to stop. Bikini survived the loud thing. The real question is whether the ocean can survive the quiet one. The corals of Bikini Atoll grew back in the footprint of the most destructive weapons ever built, in water that once flashed hotter than the sun. They are proof of how fiercely life wants to return if we only give it the room. And they are a warning, written in living coral, about what the ocean could become almost everywhere, on the day we finally learn to lift the quiet, constant weight of ourselves off of it. Bikini Atoll is still out there tonight. A silent ring of islands with no one living on them. A lagoon full of sharks and coral where 1,000 suns once burned. The bombs have long gone quiet. The people have still not come home. And the reef keeps growing anyway, indifferent to all of it, rebuilding an entire world in the wreckage of ours. If this idea stayed with you, the way an ecosystem can come roaring back the moment a single pressure is lifted off of it, then watch our earlier story next. The one about how a remote island was brought back to life after an invasive species was finally removed. It is the very same force at work, only this time on dry land. The video on your screen will take you straight there, and the ocean, as always, has far more to teach us than we ever expect to learn.